in the UK, I've been astonished at how little understanding of the basic facts of the American Revolution there is. Whereas in the States, people know what was happening on the 15th of February, 1774. It goes down to a really granular level. So what I've tried to do is find a story of my own, which I think is faithful to the argument, and the central argument being that really the American Revolution took Enlightenment Britain forward rather than being something completely new of its own.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, produced in partnership with GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and a producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at the precedent, meaning, and words behind the American Revolution and its critical documents. In short, we're looking at the origins of the American dream. Now, moving to introductions, Peter Moore is an English writer, historian, and lecturer. He's the author of Endeavor and The Weather Experiment, both of which were Sunday Times bestsellers in the United Kingdom. The Weather Experiment was also chosen as one of New York Times 100 notable books of 2015. Professor Moore teaches at the University of Oxford and has lectured internationally on 18th century history. He also hosts a podcast called Travels Through Time, which I encourage you to check out. Tonight's moderator, Richard Cohen, is the author of Making History, a book that we presented in this past year in the American Inspiration series. He also has written By the Sword, Chasing the Sun, and How to Write Like Tolstoy. The former publishing director of two leading publishing houses, he has edited books that have won the Pulitzer, the Booker, and many other prizes. 21 books under his watchful eye have been #1 bestsellers. Richard's written works have appeared in the New York Times Book Review and in the Wall Street Journal. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Richard will join us for the second half of our program. But to start us off, Peter, welcome to you, Peter Moore. It is such a delight to have you here. And all of us in the audience, of course, know that we set this 3 p.m. Eastern time to suit your UK time zone. And I think it'll be worth it to get your transatlantic perspective. Thank you so much for taking us back to the mid-18th century and sharing information about the unexpected influencers behind America's independence, as the Washington Post called it. I'm sure you remember that review well. They also called this group the caste beyond the founding fathers. And I love that word beyond. So we really thank you for your research. And over to you to introduce us to this cast of men and one woman, thankfully. Peter, welcome.
Margaret, it's a real pleasure to be here. Hello to all of you. I'm in southwest London at the moment. The sun has gone down, but I'm still awake, luckily enough. Well, we'll find out if I am awake enough for this subject anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I don't have long, really, but I want to introduce you to the central characters around which I've constructed this story. But let's begin at a common point of departure, because there's an image on your screen at the moment that I guess will be instantly familiar to so many of you. This really captures one of the, I don't want to use the word iconic because it feels cliched, but for this this image, it's the right word, really. It's one of the iconic moments in the birth of the United States, that foundation story of yours. And we can date this moment pretty well because there's lots of documents that tell us what was going on throughout that summer of 1776. This is the moment when Thomas Jefferson, much younger than the two people he's there with, is presenting his draft copy of the Declaration of Independence. So you have three members of the fabled committee of five here. You have John Adams, obviously, who's sitting, looking, I suppose, a little bit inscrutable in the center. Franklin is running his eyes over the text, and Jefferson is looking, I suppose, a little bit nervous, because you would be a bit nervous if Benjamin Franklin was about to critique your copy. But this is this really central moment, and I suppose we can imagine here Franklin reading those famous words, "when in the course of human events," and so on, and going through to the words around which I structure my book: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is a 20th century representation of an 18th century moment. So it's, I suppose, a romanticized image, but we do know that something like this happened. It's testified in the documents that we have. We know that that Franklin did make editorial interventions, and that this moment really was at the start of a period of redrafting that went on between maybe the 20th of June and the 4th of July, with the critical moment really coming on the 2nd of July, when it was adopted by the Congress, and it was actually passed and signed on the 4th of July, which of course then becomes the first Independence Day. So I think it's what we're looking at here is the original rough draft of the Declaration, which I believe still exists. Well, I know it still exists. I think it's in the New York Public Library now, and you can have a look at it on online. There's a digitized copy, and it's a really fascinating document in itself, for all the little editorial changes to the text that you're familiar with. Franklin's big editorial intervention in the preamble was to include the words self-evident, which is a nice Enlightenment twist, looking at with your eyes. These things are self-evident. But already Jefferson has caught much of the flavor of the text that we're familiar with today. I think at this point, the famous line goes, "life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness." So it's a little bit different. There's an extra "and" in there. But essentially, this great American moment is captured here, and already the document is well on its way. But if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to tell you about some of the other characters who are not so familiar. So let's go, let's back up a bit. A year before this moment, in 1776, we have a very, very similar use of language from a man called William Strahan, who is probably the least well-known of my characters in the book. Strahan is a Scottish-born, London-based printer. He was originally called William Strahan, and he came to London in the 1730s. And you can see him writing in a letter to his great friend Benjamin Franklin these words: "I wish the liberty and happiness of all of our brethren with you." Okay. Now, I think these are the little things that, as a historian, really provoke you. You wonder, well, hang on, there's a real echo the next year in the Declaration of this language. And I'm not making the case that there's a connection between this particular letter that Strahan wrote and the Declaration. But what I am pointing out here to you now is that the language that Jefferson was using at the time in that famous preamble was not wholly original. And this is something that Jefferson owned himself. He said his idea, or his job, wasn't to recreate new language. His job was to encapsulate the best thoughts that people were expressing at the time in the most eloquent way. And so you can see here these words: liberty, happiness, already. And if we just go back to Strahan for a moment, I just want to dwell on him, because he's one of the important characters in my book because of his friendship with Benjamin Franklin, which stretches over the whole course of the book, really between the 1740s and 1775. And like Franklin, he's a printer by trade. He's really interested in politics, and together they discuss endlessly what is going to be the fate of British America. Is it going to remain as part of the British Empire, or is it, as Franklin comes to believe going to be an independent country. And this is, I suppose, one of the central plot lines in the book, and Strahan and Franklin fall out over this. I just want to quote to you the letter that Franklin was writing to Strahan on the very same day as this. So this is on the 5th of July, 1775. I think this is one of the great letters in the whole of the revolutionary literature. So Strahan, by this point, has become a member of the British Parliament, and he's sitting on the green benches in Westminster behind Lord North, as all these coercive acts have been passed through Parliament. And Franklin writes, "Mr. Strahan, you're a member of Parliament and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours, Benjamin Franklin." I think that's one of the great sign-offs to a letter in history. I'm reliably informed that you can buy a t-shirt on eBay with that very letter inscribed on the front of it. But let's move on. He's one of the characters I talk about. We maybe get back to Strahan in a bit. But the next character is called John Wilkes. Now, really what I was trying to do when I started constructing this story was solve a few mysteries of my own. And a lot of you who are listening today will instantly know that the greatest book about the American Revolution was written by Bernard Bailyn in the 1960s. It's called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And in it, he writes about John Wilkes and how John Wilkes was an incredibly important influence at an early point in the American revolutionary story. Here you can see him. I'm, again, centering in on these important words. Liberty, I consider as the birthright of every subject of the British Empire, and I hold Magna Charta to be as in full force in America as in Europe. Wilkes's story in the 1760s is both absolutely extraordinary and completely forgotten. I first began to conceive of this book as being a British prelude to the American Revolution, with Wilkes playing this part of the protagonist who upends politics with his great campaigns for liberty. Wilkes was a brilliant writer, a very unfaithful lover, a very daring politician, and he ran into great problems with the British political establishment, who first had him thrown out of Parliament and then had him declared an outlaw. His story was huge in Britain, but what really interested me when I was writing the book was that I found out that his story was huge in America as well. So maybe we'll get back to Wilkes in a bit, but that's another part of that sentence: liberty, liberty and Wilkes. Next slide, please, if you can. Catharine Macaulay. Now, a lot of people don't remember John Wilkes, and they remember John Wilkes Booth, who is a later incarnation of the same name or a similar name. And a lot of people forget Macaulay, the historian, because they remember the Victorian Macaulay historian. But the original Macaulay historian was this one that you see in front of you right now, and somebody else who I write about. And let me pull out this quote. I'll read it for you. "It's only the democratical system rightly balanced which can secure the virtue, liberty, and happiness of society." Again, you can see an approximation with the text, which becomes really famous less than a decade later. Macaulay is an astonishing character. I think that she should be cherished and celebrated, really, in the American founding story, because she played an incredibly important role. She was very skeptical about monarchy. She was a great advocate for a Republican government. She thought that power should be split because she didn't believe that anyone could be trusted with any power. So her concerns really were the concerns of the American patriots. And through the late 1760s into the 1770s, her writings were hugely popular in the American colonies. She wrote and corresponded with Abigail Adams and lots of the others. I mean, there's a whole list. If you go and have a look at her published letters, which recently have been put out by Oxford University Press, I think you'll find all of her correspondence with these great founding characters, and there's a bit of a topsy-turvy feel to these letters as well, because she's in a way the more prominent of the figures. In 1775, probably one of the most perilous moments of the whole foundation story, Macaulay wrote a pamphlet in support of the First Continental Congress. So she's a really important character. Again, we'll get back to her. I know I've got to keep moving on, so let's keep moving on. But you can see, if you look in the corner, a little nod to Sidney in the bottom, the great champion of liberty from the 17th century. Okay, next slide. Someone who didn't like Macaulay as well, someone who didn't like Macaulay at all, I should say, but someone who appears in my story as a foil to the progressives, to the Enlightenmenters who believed that society should be moving forward at a pace and all development was good, with Samuel Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson's birthday today in the old style, so I hope you'll kind of wish him well on this occasion. He's a real hero of mine. I'm from Lichfield in Staffordshire, very much like him. But I have to say, if he's got a home in America, it may well be Cambridge in Massachusetts, because that's where a lot of his papers are kept in the library. There's so many great Johnsonian scholars have come from the United States, which I've always thought a real strange thing, because he was very rude about the American patriots. In response to Macaulay's pamphlet in 1775, Johnson wrote one called Taxation, No Tyranny, which included a phrase that once read is never forgotten, which is, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that later. But Johnson was very much on the side of what he thought as the common person. He was very interested in what he thought of as the living world. And the big theme throughout all of Johnson's writing was about happiness. In 1759, he produced a novella called Rasselas, which is all about the quest for happiness. He uses this phrase, the pursuit of happiness, 5 times in his writings before 1776. Now, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic when the book came out about Johnson and Jefferson and the connections between the two of them, not making the argument that Jefferson took that particular phrase, which is so quintessentially his own, from Johnson, but in the sense that they both thought about happiness in a similar manner, that Jefferson and Johnson both believed that happiness wasn't something that could be safely obtained. It was something that had to be strived for. Okay. I've got a couple of minutes left to tell you the next 2 characters. So let's move on. Thomas Paine is someone who, again, falls between the gaps in a way. He doesn't neatly fit into the Founding Fathers narrative, but the British obviously don't consider him quite one of their own as well. But you can see here he is talking about happiness in a similar way to Johnson. You can see, well, just a bit of context about Thomas Paine. For those of you who don't know, he came to Philadelphia in late 1774. In 1775, he became this pioneering magazine journalist. And the one quality about him, which was just extraordinary, was his prose style. In 1776, he started that fabled year off with his pamphlet Common Sense, which by the end of the year, I mean, there's been so many different estimates for how many copies it sold, but some say as many as 250,000 or 500,000 people read Common Sense, and it's often described as the book that started the revolution. People have said, I think it was John Adams who said, without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would not have been used at all, or something probably a bit more eloquent, I imagine, given it was the 18th century. But here we have Paine with a very Enlightenment-ish idea of good order. The science of the politician consists in fixing the true point of happiness and freedom. Those men would deserve the gratitude of ages who should discover a mode of government that contained the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. Quite like that quote. So we've got one more character to go, and then my whistle-stop tour of characters will come to a close, and I can talk with Richard a bit more about the story. So the last one in this half dozen is someone who needs certainly no introduction from me, apart from my observation, which I have to say, is quite unshakable that Benjamin Franklin is the greatest American of all time because of what he represents and what he lived through. If anyone wants to argue with me about that, I'll happily argue with you. But this quote in itself isn't particularly profound. It's Franklin's attitude towards happiness, which comes down in this quote to a kind of stoicism, I suppose. But the quality about it that I really like is that it's Franklin's writing. Franklin's writing, his prose style, is one of my favorite things of all. It's just a wonderful treat to read him. He's such a quotable, enjoyable, playful writer. And I used him as a kind of touchstone throughout the book to knit everything together. And I can't quite read the quote out here because there's a big picture of my face on top of it. So I'll have to leave you to navigate it yourself. But this idea of Franklin and the weather and waiting for the clouds to pass and the sun to shine, I think really captures something. But also what I hope I've showed you here is just, or given you a taste of, is of some of these characters who, not only Jefferson, but these characters were thinking about the business of life, the business of liberty, and the business of happiness as well. Okay, thank you.
Now, I think it's at this point that I come in as your questioner, Peter. And I have to say, first of all, I really enjoyed the book. I sped through it because it is so well written and so lively. And it was fun to read. And I was just wondering, was it fun to write? Did you have fun doing it?
Occasionally, I'm sure there must have been some points. I mean, when I say that what I said about Franklin, I absolutely mean. And this was a period so rich in ideas, so rich in writing. I think of the American Revolution as a great era of ink and paper. That was the kind of physical matter of the American Revolution. It's not like if you think of the English Revolution of the 17th century, it might be more of Puritans standing in pulpits and shouting out screeds about God. The American Revolution was very much pamphlets or stamps or you know these kind of things, documents, and I just loved working with that primary source material. I thought it was fabulous, and that went for Wilkes, who was a fabulous writer. Johnson is probably the greatest prose style in the English language. Macaulay was quite boring sometimes, but when she was fired up, she could really fire a few high Mars rockets of her own. And Thomas Paine, for example, if you watch back at the 2009 inaugural address of Barack Obama on the steps of the Capitol, he quotes Thomas Paine for about 70 seconds at one point. So his language is still really quotable today. So all of that was wonderful. What I found more challenging was trying to make it all stick together, because I'm essentially writing about a whole generation through this little chain of 6 characters, which is a challenge.
And it's essentially a book about writers, not necessarily writers of books, but as you say, writers of pamphlets, although, you know, you've got a publisher, you've got a politician, and so on. Catharine Macaulay looks peculiarly like Hilary Mantel, about the same age, incidentally. But one of the things that you're obviously arguing, it's central to the book, is that the American war for independence came about because of writers. And I'm wondering how well read people in America at that time, and historians say, that the working class of mid-18th century America was peculiarly well read, unlike parts of Britain, for instance. How did their writing generally, your 6, how did their writings get across?
Well, that was one thing that really staggered me, actually, is they got across, and they got across quite quickly. So let me give you a date, which I think is as important to the foundation story as many of the other big ones. And this is the 30th of April, 1763. John Wilkes is taken into custody, put into the Tower of London as a member of Parliament for the constituency of Aylesbury. and this hugely scandalous moment in British political history. This story was being reported in all across these colonies within 6 weeks. The time it took a ship to sail across. And not only was the story being reported, it was being reported with the zealous mania of a 21st century cable news anchor. You can imagine them going mad over these things. And so this is, I mean, one of the funny points that Gordon Wood makes in one of his books on the Revolution is he's talking about the establishment of the first newspaper in South Carolina, and he said, of course, the first news item that was covered was about Essex in the east of England, and this weird sense of this weird obsession that colonial Americans had with the news agenda in Westminster. So there was a huge amount of crossover. People in the because from the British point of view, there's a very famous stereotypes of the colonials being borderline barbaric, whether not being able to read anything at all, which was very far from the case. The colonial American readership was very well informed, and they had a lot of material to get to. There's a great scene I've got in the book, actually, when I think he's a cleric who goes across from Philadelphia to London, and he meets Johnson, and Johnson's in his usual destruction mode. And he says, "What do you know? You're from America. And what do you read in America? You don't read anything." He said, "But sir, we read the Rambler." And at this, Johnson's perfectly mollified, and he changes his attitude. And it actually turns out that Johnson was hugely popular in America. He was, there was editions of all of his major works sometimes within months. So Franklin was the first to print Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes, which went into Poor Richard's Almanac. Well, not into a kind of august poetry collection. It went into Poor Richard's Almanac, and so that was the quality of the kind of stuff that was getting published at the time. So that crossover is really interesting. Yeah.
Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You very adroitly, sleight of hand, choose that famous phrase as a way to organize your book. It's organized into 3 sections, according to each word or phrase. But I say sleight of hand because other words that might have been used. I mean, you think that the Canadian Constitution brings in property as a crucial element. The French have, of course, égalité. Do you think there's ever a chance that something other than that particular line could have been used?
To tell this story, no, because I think my editors would never have tolerated another word and another section. But I think there was something peculiarly American about that phrase, which has just always struck me throughout my life. And I'm sure everyone who's listening today they can't even remember when they first heard life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because it was almost there from birth. And it was when I was finding these echoes of that similar phrase. So you can go back. What a lot of people do when they approach this kind of story is almost like a decoding detective. So, well, you follow this word back and you get to this person, you get back. And you always get back to John Locke and life, liberty, and the state. That's the kind of you can go further back to the Epicureans if you want to, but Locke's pretty safe. But there is something very interesting. Christopher Hitchens used to talk about this idea that you move from life, liberty, and a state to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, what the hell is that? That's a weird, kind of perversion of a very otherwise solid sentence. But what is this pursuit of happiness? So this kind of obviously generates a lot of questions for the writer, and lots of questions were asked. But happiness in the Enlightenment age was seen as the great aspiration. Before, if you said to people in the court of King Henry VIII, would you like to pursue happiness? They would think you were crazy. There's no happiness. The happiness happens after you die, when you're in the celestial uplands. But this idea in the Enlightenment was that happiness was not just achievable, it was achievable for anybody, even if you were, just a normal person. It's an exciting idea.
You're saying that, these rights are self-evident was a Franklin addition, but what's the rebuttal over taking out sacred and undeniable?
Well, listen, what actually happened during its editorial process in June of 1776 is probably best explained in that wonderful book. I can't remember off the top of my head who wrote it. I'll tell you in 1 second. Yeah, it's Carl Becker who wrote a wonderful analysis of the Declaration text about 100 years ago now. And so he makes a lot of the connections between different modes of thought. I really didn't want to get caught in the weeds of points like this, because I thought that was more the preserve of academics. What I wanted to look at really were these ideas in essence. What were they? How were they driving people? Because as a historian, the way I think about history and how I've always written my books is try and find the currents that go beneath the waterline. Do you see what I mean? What's tugging people along? What are they moving towards? And often these things aren't so easily spoken. It's nice when you get flashes of moments like this. So, for example, the substitution of self-evident is actually, you can connect that to a broader seam of Franklinian thought. You can see him looking at his electrical apparatus when he's doing that. But that wasn't my major concern, if you see what I mean.
We're talking about Catharine Macaulay, and one of the people who's written in questions was asking, were there any other women who really contributed on either side of the Atlantic to the idea of the American dream?
Well, that is, yeah, that's a good question, because there were, you see, formerly politics was a very exclusive space for men to deal with each other, and not only was it gender specific, it was very class specific as well. So this idea of the gentleman, the gentry, and the ordinary people, and Macaulay herself operated within that sphere. And I wanted to show her as someone who was actively participating in this discussion, but she wasn't really allowed to do it. What she would do, and I quite like this about her, is she would essentially what she wrote was these big history books, which are huge impenetrable tomes about 17th century history. But she would use those as a way of commenting on ideas about tyranny, liberty, the abuse of power, how humans are really apt to corruption, things like this. And the other thing that she did really well was she'd cook up an idea for a pamphlet on someone like Thomas Hobbes. Okay, so she'd write, the title would be an inquiry into the ideas of Thomas Hobbes and certain ideas of government. And she'd write about Hobbes for 5 or 6 pages. And then she'd abandon that idea completely and then write about politics afterwards, which women were just not supposed to do at all. So, so Macaulay actually became something of a political commentator, we'd call them today, someone who popped up. And she was so unusual that she was encouraged, because and there's this wonderful phrase actually in the critical review for when her first history came out, and they said, no longer is history confined, no longer is politics confined to those of us who wear beards, which may have a kind of personal resonance for me at least. But there's this idea of her being an insurgent who managed to get into this world of political discourse. Now, there were many other women at the time who influenced ideas and thinking. So you only have to read about Johnson and Charlotte Lennox and see all the blue stockings, all these characters who were contributing to thought, but they did it, I think, more in an indirect way. And of course, you have Mercy Otis and Warren and Abigail Adams and people like this who were not, they're not shrinking violets as well. They were saying that, what about the women, famously. So there were women's voices in this discussion, and I think a huge amount of work has been done recently on finding those voices. I just used Macaulay as my main character because I think she's so interesting and so overlooked.
Well, Abigail Adams, of course, her husband told her to pipe down. But to go back to, the French égalité, equality didn't feature in Jefferson's drafts. And one thinks, considering the number of people who were enslaved at that time, did any thought, as far as we know, go into the African Americans and what their rights should be?
Well, and this is one of the great missed opportunities of history, because it took another war 100 years later really to solve that question. And I think there's an argument to be made. There were opportunities that were missed in the 1770s. 1770 is a really interesting moment in history this is just before the formal beginning of the abolition movement in the UK, where you get people like Clarkson, who walk around with his famous chest, and Wilberforce, and I think Johnson's really interesting here. A character I've spoken about elsewhere is Francis Barber, who was a Jamaican slave boy who was taken in the most extraordinary journey to live with Johnson at Gough Square. And he arrived there. So this is just off Fleet Street in London. For any of you who know about the geography of London, this is Johnson's big townhouse, where there was, a small boy from the plantations in Jamaica arrived. And so Johnson was very much involved in this idea of about liberty. He hated slavery. The idea of colonialism was really abhorrent to him. So I wrote about this as well. But also in 1773, you have the Somerset case, a famous legal case in Britain, where there's an opinion made by Judge Mansfield, who says that people can't be held as slaves in Britain. And at the same time, there are, societies, abolition societies, which are beginning to form in America as well. And one character who does have something to say about this, although this is controversial, I should say, because it's very difficult to pinpoint absolutely who wrote what at this time, because a lot of journalism was unsigned. But Thomas Paine is often credited, and a lot of people believe that he wrote this really angry editorial in the Philadelphia newspapers against slavery in 1775. So that mood was there. But really, when Jefferson was drafting the Declaration, his challenge was a really steep one, because he had to find a mode of language and expression that was palatable to everybody. And Franklin sat him down, put his arm around him, and told him that you should never get involved in the writing of documents for public bodies. There's a really funny story about that. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff about slavery just went in the drafting. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Justice Mansfield. Of course, it was a nod to his judgments about slavery that caused Jane Austen to call her novel Mansfield Park.
Okay, well, that's
I was wondering, you've got, you and me, two Englishmen talking about a very American subject. If this book had been written today by an American author, do you think they'd have chosen your same group of six, or would they have tried to introduce other people?
It's very difficult for me to speculate on that, but what I would say is there's a huge, and you probably have a perspective on this as well, so it'd be interesting to know what you think, but there's a huge differential in how this story is remembered in these two different countries, in the United States and Great Britain. And you might say, well, of course, that's because your big theme in your last book was about who tells history and why do we tell the stories we tell. Okay. In the UK, I've been astonished at how little understanding of the basic facts of the American Revolution there is, whereas in the States, people know what was happening on the 15th of February 1774. It goes down to a really granular level. So what I've tried to do is find a story of my own, which I think is faithful to the argument, and the central argument being that really the American Revolution took Enlightenment Britain forward rather than being something completely new of its own. Would they use different characters? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we can hear from someone in the. I'm sure everyone will say you should put this person in.
On to hearers' questions, and one of them that's come up is just that war was far from certain. I mean, one of the qualities of your book is the suspense about what's going to happen, and that really a huge number of people in the States, even when they were bridling under the stupidity of many British politicians, let alone the king, were longing for there not to be a war.
Franklin being the chief one, I think, right through till 1774. We're now on the 250th anniversary. If there's any journalists here and they want to go off and write the anniversary, but we're right on the anniversary of the Hutchinson Letters affair, which was this moment that all went spectacularly badly wrong for Franklin when he ended up being abused by the Privy Council on Whitehall. Before this moment, I think Franklin is desperately trying to bring things back into some sort of order. And I mean, he really is being driven to distraction by the utter stupidity of British politicians. Well, that's something that hasn't changed in the past quarter of a millennium, I have to say. But from the Stamp Act to the I don't know. I mean, it's just, if you go back to the policy making of 1765 onwards, there's so many missteps, and I think there was a huge emotional tie between the colonies and Great Britain, and it's almost astonishing in hindsight looking back. I think there was obviously going to be some rupture at some point, but the fact that it happened so soon in history is something which is remarkable to me. But you get someone like William Franklin, Franklin's son, and he, I quote him right at the beginning saying, "We wish that Great Britain was a ship and we could bring her over and anchor her next to it." I mean, this idea of, all the best culture, the best fashion, the best ideas, all these things, people really regarded Britain very highly, and that caused a very deep and enduring emotional bond, quite aside from the financial dependencies and the military help and all the rest of this. It was a strong thing.
You've written a book about the American Declaration of Independence. It's a declaration, and yet the phrase that then gets often used is the American dream, which is a very different notion, declaring what you think you have a right to, and then the dream of what might be possible.
But I think those things do combine at the same time, and especially within that line. And this is what I think, in a way, is the genius of Jefferson, because what he had to do, so this is the astonishing part of the story, really. Again, I mean, this is the foundation story for America is absolutely astonishing. I can't stress this enough. But the fact that there was someone like Thomas Jefferson on hand in the 1770s, come down from Monticello, probably one of the greatest writers in Western history, not because he was, Shakespearean in his dramatic scale or whatever, but he had a wonderful quality for distilling things, and he could state things so beautifully and so succinctly. And what he did in that one document was not only clarify all of the crimes that the British had committed against the colonists, but in that preamble, he also sketched out what he thought the rights of a country should be. And those things are pretty much held. I mean, they're still argued about today. And you can always, if you want to, I suppose, use them as a yardstick for the health of America today. You say, well, how much liberty is there and how much happiness is there in the country? That would be the Jeffersonian measure, I suppose. So they are there.
Well, that leads to the questions from hearers. And Robert Wong writes, has the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the Declaration of Independence been adopted by other countries?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you, Robert. But also, you have put me on the spot somewhat, because I'm not sure. There's been various declarations. The history of declarations is an interesting one. It was a kind of really weird thing for the Continental Congress to do. the ones that come into my head are only really about the French one that you mentioned before. I think there's something quite peculiarly American about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I will be very happily corrected if someone can find an island somewhere in the South Seas or somewhere which has a similar mission statement. I'm not aware of one. Sorry.
Another listener says, the use of self-evident seems to have a likeness to the language of mathematical proofs, contrast with any divine rights of royalty. Is there any substance to this guess? And hearers might be interested to know that Peter's next book is going to be about the writing of the Principia Mathematica by Isaac Newton. So
well, maybe we'll have to see if I'm allowed. So
does it have that?
Well, this is quintessential Enlightenment thinking. Is that here's your idea, now go and prove it. So this was, the idea of proof and what burdens of proof should be is the kind of thing that the natural philosophers of the time spent a lot of effort and energy on, and it does actually amplify the Enlightenment quality of the document that Franklin added this. But this was just how those brains worked. Well, here's the point. But is it self-evident that, I'm not sure if you actually sit down and think about it, is it self-evident? I suppose we're now bounding into metaphysics here. But I think one thing that is very interesting to stress, there was another really important antecedent for Jefferson's draft, and that was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written by Charles Mason a few weeks before. And that talks about the rights of mankind being something like the right to life, liberty, and the obtaining of happiness and safety. Now, one of the things that really interested me is how did that change from the obtaining happiness and safety to the pursuit of happiness? And what I argued in this Atlantic piece that I mentioned before is that there's something quintessentially American about this pursuit of happiness, because it's saying that, look, everyone's got the right to go out and chase happiness, chase it as much as you like, but we're not going to be around for you if it all goes wrong. So it's that kind of, and I often see that in American society today. It's kind of a bit of a go-getter society, but the safety net's not the same as in maybe other countries. It's a kind of progressive.
Safety does come into other countries' constitutions, interestingly. But another question, do you think it was a Puritan influence on the colonies that increased the level of education and instituted early higher education that, in a way, helped the revolution happen?
I think that's a really good point, actually. And I think that's right. It's often said about Franklin, who that he was so good because he unified Puritan instincts with Enlightenment values. So he had that kind of Protestant work ethic, the famous get up and get going and charge on. And I think that did actually catalyze a lot of the early growth in the colonies. And you look at the early educational institutions; they're heavily influenced. Really great document that I write about at one point, though, is Franklin's idea for his own academy in Philadelphia, which of course then develops to become the University of Pennsylvania after a bit of a rocky start. And Franklin was absolutely not interested in religion at all. He wanted people out with trowels, gardening in the wilds of Philadelphia. He wasn't bothered about, and he had this kind of really caustic attitude to the scholars of Harvard, who he thought were, just so rigid in their thinking that they were useless for nothing. But that might have something to do with his hang up about social class. I'm sure it does. But so I think in answer to that question, I think religion obviously played a really important role early on in the colonial story. Later on, less so, and it's often said that the founding generation was the least religious generation of all the generations there's ever been. So I don't know, I've heard that before.
We've got a long list of questions. I should say you very kindly said that you will answer them after the program in one shape or form.
If you send your questions in, I'm sure Margaret, who's kindly keeping us in order today, will send them on to me, and I'll try and get back to you. So if you've got a particular question, I'll do my best. I can't promise, but I'll do my best.
One possibly last question is Auntie Manzella asks, did you guys ever see Ben Franklin, not the real person, Ben Franklin by Ken Burns? I love Ken Burns, but I've not seen his film about Franklin. Have you?
No, I'm not aware of that film, actually. There's a massive gaping hole in my knowledge of this. No. Is it recent?
People get forgotten. I mean, you kindly mentioned my book, Making History. I've got a whole chapter on women historians, and I don't write about Catharine Macaulay because my American editors, my British editors, specialist readers, none of them mention her. And it's, as I said teasingly to you, you don't have an actual picture of her in the book itself. And she's one of the people who's, dropped through the net.
She made the she was basically cancelled in an equivalent way in her own time, because she made the grievous error of marrying a footman who was many years her junior, which was just the excuse all the people who did not like her needed to remove her. I mean, she was a bit of a figure of fun at the end. But there was Mary Wollstonecraft, who very much is remembered and is very much celebrated by the Romantics. She says that Catharine Macaulay is the greatest Englishwoman who's ever lived, which is the kind of quote that authors dream of to put on the front of their books. I think, I do believe that she's of such importance to some very crucial moments in the Foundation story that she needs to be celebrated. And she was a very, very brave writer, and that's probably what did for her in the end. She was a bit too brave, maybe.
Now, we've got a minute before we go back to Margaret. So a simple question. Is there any question you'd have liked to have been asked? Maybe I should have got round to more, but that you'd like to have a go at?
Well, let's put me on the spot.
Well, I'll save you. John Werner says, have you carried this kind of discussion to any high schools in the USA as part of history courses? No,
I'd love to. I really enjoy talking to American audiences about this, because I really, I've huge admiration for scholars of the American Revolution. I find it such a fascinating period of history, and this isn't me trying to replace anything that anybody's said at all. I'm just saying, well, actually, this is this thing that was also happening at the same time, and there's a very weird relationship between Great Britain and the United States, which goes back right to the beginning, which is very much like bickering cousins in a way that I don't think many people have really worked out. People go on about special relationships and things like that, which always masks something more interesting and a lot deeper. And in this, I came to both understand my own country and America, because after 1776, Britain really does retreat into itself. It becomes a much more reactionary place, a much more socially conservative. There's the kind of homegrown populism, whereas America really takes forward the ideals that Britain had. And the one thing that I realized and really struck me was that for the first 76 years of the 18th century, Britain was the revolutionary, glamorous nation. But after that, it changed. And a lot of people don't remember that.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Indeed, what a fascinating thought, revolutionary, because of course, all of us who are American, revolutionary spirit that we have here in Boston, don't see it that way. So it's been so enlightening, and what a marvelous discussion, this review of America's critical documents and also the English Enlightenment. And if you could come back and talk about metaphysics, I'm sure many of us would be on for that. What a fascinating dialogue. Thank you. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Peter Moore to read from his book, a brilliant passage. Peter, back to you.
Okay, right, I'll get on with it. This is from the prologue. It's called July the 4th. I bet you can guess the year, so I won't tell you. This is just after Jefferson has been given the job of writing the Declaration, or drafting it, I should say. Jefferson met this challenge in sparkling style. From its opening sentence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, his words flowed with what the historian Karl Lotus Becker has termed that felicitous, haunting cadence, which is the peculiar quality of Jefferson's best writing. When Adams first read the draft, he found himself delighted with its high tone and the flights of oratory with which it abounded. Some parts of the preamble were then tightened or fortified by Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who were also on the Committee of Five. Together, they also scrutinized Jefferson's list of 24 distinct charges against King George III before the draft was submitted for consideration. Then Jefferson's agonies truly began. Words, phrases, entire paragraphs were picked over, quibbled at, or struck out as Congress sought to find a balance that was palatable to all. By the morning of the 4th of July, with about a quarter of his initial draft deleted, Jefferson's miseries were at an end. Perhaps the tall, rangy Virginian enjoyed a morning stroll to the State House along Philadelphia's clean, cobbled, regular streets. Or perhaps, like the gentleman that he was, he rode his horse. We just don't know. We can only be sure that at about breakfast time, Abraham Clark, a delegate from New Jersey, was confiding in a letter home that a declaration, I expect, will this day pass Congress. It is nearly gone through, after which it will be proclaimed with all the state and solemnity circumstance will admit. It has gone so far that we must now be a free, independent state or a conquered country. Several items of business lay before Congress that morning. Adopting the amended text of the Declaration was second on the list. So it was that in the mid-morning, a fair handwritten copy of the text was produced. It was presumably a single sheet of standard Crown paper, 15 by 20 inches, but one that Jefferson, with his tidy quantifying mind, might have calculated would reduce the size of the British Empire by around 400,000 square miles. This crucial document in the history of the United States is now missing, presumed destroyed. But we can just about catch sight of it in our mind's eyes, the words flowing along in Jefferson's suave, schoolmasterly hand. Much of the emotive language on slavery, King George, and so on, had been scratched out during the previous days. But the most flourishing phrase had survived with only minimal adjustment to the end. This was a trio of nouns that appeared in the second sentence, nouns that grew rhythmically and enchantingly in length. These words were destined one day to become an evergreen mantra for politicians and a shorthand for that ideal we call the American dream: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
Peter, how spectacular to be put in the room with these gentlemen, such wordsmiths and editors, and also such idealists, designers truly of our American dream. We really thank you so much for coming and joining us today. A reminder to our audience, Peter's book, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, is available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. No signed documents are available, but if you do purchase through the store, we thank you for using the code AMINS23 to indicate that you were on the lecture today. We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted you joined us. If you're researching a time in history or a family, we are here to help. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs providing skills for family historians. As you can see in the programs listed on the screen, we work with all times and places that make up America's history, and also clearly the English Enlightenment. NEHGS members can access our digital archives, including 1.4 billion searchable records any time of day or night. Let us help you discover and tell your family story. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. Okay, but back to tonight. Thank you to our great authors, Peter and Richard, for this enlightening talk. You gentlemen are inspiring. We feel very lucky to be flies on the wall. Thank you. I also thank the teams here at the Brew Family Learning Center and GBH Forum Network. And to the audience out there in Zoomland, thank you. We appreciate your interest in America's history and in English Enlightenment. We wish each of you a good afternoon or evening wherever you are, and we hope you will join us soon again. Good night, gentlemen. Good night, all.